Hello, second grade scholars. Welcome to Science with me, Miss Taylor. I would like to tell you a little bit about air pressure, and I would like to read you a story that explains about this weather concept. So, before we start reading our story about air pressure and how that affects weather, we have a few vocabulary words. So, our first one is meteorologist. And a meteorologist is a person who studies weather. And a person who studies weather, a scientist who studies weather, is called a meteorologist. So you may have seen meteorologists on TV, like on the news. Um, so they help to predict the weather and tell us about the weather so that we can be prepared. So the next word we have is a thermometer. And a thermometer is a tool used to measure temperature. And temperature is a word that just means how warm or cold the air around us is. So temperature measures how warm or cold the air is, and a thermometer is what we use to measure the temperature. And actually, there are two different ways that we can measure the temperature. You can kind of see on this little thermometer here. In America, we use this side. It's called the Fahrenheit scale. It has a little F at the top. So Fahrenheit. And then in most of the rest of the world, they use this side of the thermometer. It's called Celsius. And Celsius is, it's used in most of the world. But sometimes in America, we do things a little differently, don't we? So we use the Fahrenheit system. All right, water vapor. So water vapor is a word that means little tiny droplets of water in the air. And water vapor, these little teeny tiny drops of water, they're so tiny that we can't even see them. And so as I look around, I can't see these tiny droplets, but they are in the air. And sometimes we can feel the water vapor. Like in the summertime, it feels kind of humid, kind of like sticky and damp. And then in the wintertime, sometimes it feels very dry. I know sometimes I have to put hand lotion on because my skin gets really dry. So then there's not a lot of water vapor in the air during the winter. So that leads us to our next word is humidity. So humidity is the amount of water vapor in the air. So you may have heard people say in the summertime, oh, it's very humid in the summer. And that means there's lots of water vapor in the air. It feels kind of sticky and damp. And then in the wintertime, often there is not a lot of humidity. There's not a lot of moisture or water vapor in the air. All right, and this little sign is a percentage sign. So a lot of times we talk about the humidity as like the percentage of humidity in the air. The next word we have is air pressure. Now this is kind of a funny idea because air, we think about air as not having any weight. It just kind of is all around us. It doesn't have weight. But in fact, air does have weight. And that's why I have a picture of a scale here. Now, this is not really a scale that you would use to measure air pressure. This is like a scale that you would use to weigh yourself to see how much you weigh. But I just put that there so that we can kind of start to think about this different idea of air having weight. Because I know when I think about air, usually I just think, oh, I just walk right through it and there's no weight. But in fact, air does have weight, and we're going to learn more about that in our story today. And the last word we have here, scoot myself out of the way, is a barometer. And a barometer is a tool used to measure air pressure. So meteorologists will often look at the barometer, and it has a scale here. You can kind of see there's some arrows here. And when the air pressure gets kind of up to, here we can see a number 30 and 31. This is when it gets kind of dry and we have high pressure. And then if it drops below 30, it says change. And that means the weather might be changing. So we're going to learn about air pressure and barometers today too. All right. So what will the weather be? So I read this story, part of the story, a couple weeks ago when we were talking about fronts. So this is kind of the second half of the story. All right, and Miss Tina will scoot herself out of the way. There we go. Meteorologists, people who study the weather, try to predict where fronts will form. So remember that a front is just kind of like a big mass of air that moves in, and often or I should say, the mass is kind of the front part of that big mass of air. And when the fronts move in and they kind of push out another big mass or group of air, where the two meet is called a front. So meteorologists, they kind of look for fronts, and you can see on their map here that this area here, you can imagine this bubble of air moving down. This would be a cold front moving in. And then down here, you can see these kind of half circles that are red. That shows a warm front moving in. So that would be going this way. And where the warm front meets the cold front is where we often get some interesting weather. They measure the temperature of the air at different places around the Earth. They find out where the warm air is and where the cold air is. A thermometer measures temperature. So they've got some thermometers here, and she has one. She's in a warm climate. Looks like she's in the desert with some cactuses. And we can see that the thermometer is going way up here. It's quite warm. And then he has a thermometer, and it looks like he is somewhere cold, and there's snow, and the temperature is quite low on this thermometer. A wind vane tells what direction the wind blows. So you may have seen some of these around, a wind vane. So the wind blows it, and then we can kind of see which direction the wind is coming from. They watch to see where the air moves. They measure how fast it goes. And there's another thing here, and this, let's see, anemometer. And an anemometer measures wind speed. So it's kind of a cool tool that measures how fast the wind is blowing. Meteorologists also measure the amount of water vapor or humidity in the air. Water vapor is what makes air feel damp or humid. Lots of water vapor rises from the ocean. That is why air along coastlines feels humid. So we can see here when the sun warms up the water, all the water on Earth, whether it's in an ocean or a lake or a stream, or even the bits of water that land on the grass and things like that, the sun warms it, and those little teeny tiny drops of water go up into the air, and that is called evaporation. Yeah. So water vapor, the little teeny tiny droplets of water in the air. And there's something called a hygrometer that measures humidity. All right. So here we're getting into the part about air pressure. And this is the part that I was excited to show you about, to tell you about. Another thing meteorologists measure is air pressure. It's hard to imagine, but air has weight. And all of this weight presses on the Earth. It presses on everything, even you. Hundreds of pounds of air press against your body all the time. Isn't that crazy? You can't really feel the air pressing on you, but it is. You cannot feel it because air inside your body pushes out with the same force. So not only is air pressing on our bodies, but there's air inside our bodies that are kind of pressing out. And there's a kind of an illustration of that. So we can see there's the air in our bodies that's pressing out with kind of the same amount of force that the air around us is pressing on us. So again, this is an idea that is maybe new for a lot of you. I know it was new for me to think about how air has weight. And here's another example that has to do with a basketball. So you might think about, have I ever had a basketball? And then especially like if some air has gone out of a basketball, or even like a football. We have a football at my house. I know that's kind of losing air. Air inside this basketball pushes out too. You can bounce a ball when it has air in it. But what happens when you take the air out? The basketball flattens. It collapses from the weight of outside air. So When you take a little bit of air out, and you kind of take out the little part that keeps the air in there, and then all the air comes out because the air around it kind of collapses and squishes, presses down on it. That pressure. You cannot feel air pressure, and you cannot tell when it changes, but it does. Sometimes it's high, and sometimes it is low. As the air pressure changes, the weather changes. And here's another picture of a barometer. And meteorologists use this tool called a barometer to measure air pressure. So air pressure is something that we can't feel. You can't go outside and say, oh, I feel that the air pressure is high today, or I feel the air pressure is low. We can't feel that, but scientists and other people, if you have a barometer, you can measure the air pressure. When air pressure is low, air is rising into the sky. Water vapor in the air turns to liquids and clouds form. As more air rises, the pressure gets lower and lower, and the clouds get bigger and darker. Lots of rain or snow may fall when the air pressure is low. So when we have low air pressure, it's sort of like, I like to think of it as when there's not a lot of pressure, then we can have evaporation. So the sun is able to heat up the earth, and then little bits of moisture can rise into the air because there's not a lot of air pressing down. So the evaporation can happen, and then clouds can form from that evaporation, from the water vapor rising and sticking together. And that's called condensation. And then eventually precipitation, right? Luckily, the air pressure is high most of the time. When air pressure is high, air is sinking toward Earth. The skies stay mostly clear. A few puffy clouds may appear, but it won't rain. The weather is dry and sunny when the air pressure is high. So when the air pressure is high, that means there's a lot of weight in the air, um, a lot of pressure that's pressing down on the earth. And I kind of think of it as though there's sort of like this big giant who's pressing, it's giving a lot of pressure, and he's pressing down on the earth. And then little water vapor can't go up into the air to make clouds and make interesting weather because the big giant is pushing all the pressure down on the earth. It kind of helps me remember. Meteorologists measure the air pressure over the whole earth. They find the highs and the lows. They measure the temperature and humidity of the air. They see where air is warm or cold, damp or dry. They measure the speed and direction of the wind. They take their measurements over the oceans and over the land. And here's some of the other tools they use: a weather buoy. Ooh, a buoy, just like our poem about Godfrey Gordon Gustavus Gore. He was deaf as the buoy out at the Nore. They use weather airplanes, they use satellites, weather balloons, weather stations, all these tools that meteorologists use to help predict the weather so that they can tell the rest of us, the community, what the weather's going to be like, and so we can stay safe and dry and protected from the weather. Throughout the day, the measurements are sent to the National Weather Service in Maryland. There, huge computers plot the measurements on maps. The maps show the temperature, humidity, and pressure of the air all over the world, all around the world. Arrows on the maps mark the directions of the winds. You can see all the different arrows that are showing the direction of wind. And I bet you can predict, what does this H mean? What about this L? Oh, there's another H. Let's see, cold fronts and warm fronts show where storms are forming. So we can see here these little half circles, these red half circles, those are warm fronts, and they're moving in this direction, kind of the direction that the bumps are going. And then cold fronts are these blue triangles, and cold fronts are moving this way, again, kind of in the direction of the shape, that triangle. Did you figure out the L and the H? Yeah, this is a low pressure system. L for low pressure. And when we have low pressure, when there's not a lot of pressure pushing down on the earth, then we can have evaporation, condensation, clouds can form, and interesting weather can happen. But when we have this H, high pressure, that means there is a lot of pressure in the air. It's kind of pushing down on the earth. So clouds can't really form because the droplets can't go into the sky and stick together to make clouds. So when we have high pressure, we often have clear skies and it's dry and the weather is not too interesting, but it's often nice and sunny. Meteorologists everywhere study the maps. To forecast weather for tomorrow and the next day, they need to know what is happening hundreds and hundreds of miles away. They need to know what kind of air is coming. Then they can make their forecasts. Ooh, and forecast is another word for a prediction, kind of like a hypothesis. Hypothesis. What I think the answer might be. So a forecast is another word for a prediction or a hypothesis. Weather forecasts are sent to radio and television stations. They are printed in the newspapers. The forecasts tell us what kind of air is coming and what kind of weather to expect. So these kids are getting ready for some snowy weather, it looks like. Some snowy cold weather. They may call for warm and sunny days, or they may tell us to prepare for snow and strong winds. They warn farmers when a frost is coming so they can protect their crops. Don't want them to freeze. They help us decide whether our schools and airports should be closed down. So again, meteorologists make these predictions, these forecasts or hypotheses about the weather to help us stay safe. Changes in the weather are not always predictable. So not all the forecasts are right. Hey, that's okay. So remember, a hypothesis is kind of just like a prediction, a good guess. So meteorologists are also making predictions, good guesses. Sometimes they're wrong and sometimes they're right. Sometimes meteorologists tell us to take our umbrellas when we don't need them. Other times they say we won't need a jacket when we do. But meteorologists today know more about the weather than ever before. And usually we can depend on their forecasts when we're wondering, what will the weather be? So yeah, whenever we're wondering about what will the weather be, we can listen or watch a weather forecast, and usually meteorologists will give us a pretty good idea of what the weather is going to be like. All right, so to review, kind of just summarize a little bit about air pressure. So again, I mentioned this idea of air having weight is kind of a new concept for a lot of us, I think. Air has weight. Air presses down on Earth. So air is pressing down on Earth. As air pressure changes, so does the weather. When the air pressure is high, clouds do not form. The sky is clear and calm. But when the air pressure is low, clouds form. Low pressure means the weather could get very interesting. Meteorologists use barometers to measure air pressure. And there's our little barometer there. All right. And this is kind of a little phrase that I like to use to help me remember, because sometimes it can be like, wait a second, is it when the air pressure is high or low? Or I used to get really confused about this. And so some students a few years ago helped me to come up with this little phrase to help us remember. And so we can use this to help us think about air pressure and how it affects weather. So we can say when the air pressure is high, not a cloud in the sky. But when the air pressure is low, we could have rain or snow. When the air pressure is high, not a cloud in the sky. Beautiful, lovely day. When the air pressure is low, we could have rain or snow. You want to try it with me? 1, 2, 3. When the air pressure is high, not a cloud in the sky. When the air pressure is low, we could have rain or snow. All right. Nice job, scholars. So, thank you for listening and thinking about weather and air pressure. And perhaps you're wondering today, what will the weather be? Hmm, I wonder what the air pressure is like today. Do you know? All right. Have a great day, scholars. See you again soon. Bye.